Hello. This video is an introduction to functions. My name is Charles Russell, and this is part of a video series I'm doing on the JavaScript programming language. Now, this is my chicken or egg video, and I call it that because I've chosen to speak about functions here, but it could have just as easily been objects. In this language, the two things are very, very closely related. But since I went to function, there's going to have to be at least some mention of objects. When I use some terminology that's unfamiliar, I'll try to explain it, and I'll go into more detail on it on the next video. So if you're still a little confused about any object-oriented terminology by the time you get to the end of this video, by the time you get to the next one, you will definitely have a much better understanding. So bear with me. So let's get started on this. We've got to start by defining what a function is. Well, the W3 Schools defines a function as a block of code that will be executed when someone calls it. In other words, code you save for later and then use on demand. When we want to use that code block that we've got, now it may be declared by us, it may be part of the system, it could come from all kinds of different places. We have to find out how to invoke it. Now there's different ways to invoke functions in this language. I will talk about two others at the end of this particular video, but for right now we're going to stay with just the classic function invocation. And in that pattern, we're going to use the function name, an open paren, followed by the parameter list. Now think about this opening close paren as the invocation operator when used in this context. More on that in a bit. And the parameters list is a list of values to be used by the function. Now, they may be expressions, variables, literals, or objects. In my previous video, I was doing a lot of live code, and I was using a function called alert quite a bit. And that's actually a pretty good example. In this case, we have alert, and then I have passed in a literal hello world between the parentheses. So our only one parameter in this case is hello world. This would have the effect of making a dialog box that has a little OK button you could click, and the dialog box would go after you've read the text. Now, functions may return values, and so we could actually assign those values to variables. Now, notice I said the function itself returns a value. Okay, we'll get into that in a minute because there's going to be a little distinction here that becomes interesting. So in this case, I had a variable called name, and then I had some sort of function that I just made up called full name, and I'm passing in two string literals. Now, when we make our own functions, we can construct them in one of two ways. There's the statement form and an expression form. Because the statement form is a little bit more familiar to those of you coming from other languages, we'll start there. Then we'll explain a few things before we talk about the expression form. So in the statement form of this language, we start with the keyword function. Then we have the name of whatever we get in our function, and then a list of variable names that will make up the placeholders for our parameters. Now, we open up a code block. We have a series of statements and expressions, and we can choose to use a return statement or not. If we use the return statement, code will execute and control will go back to the calling code block. If we don't put a return statement in, the code will end when it finds this curly braces. This function is ended. Now we can put this return statement anywhere we want to in our code, and we can choose to return a result or not if we do so. So for instance, let's say we want to come through, and if some condition is there's no sense to do any further processing, so we can say if this condition, return. We could also put a result at any point we did that. So I could say, if I wanted to, if some condition, return a value, else if another condition, return another value, else if, you get the idea. That's normally considered bad practice. You usually want to have only one exit from a function. So because think about it, if I had a whole bunch of exit paths coming out, and there's an error. How do I know where the error came from? So it's a little bit better to have, like say, if you had to eliminate multiple exit paths of a function. So we can also immediately execute this code. So we can actually declare this function and execute it right then and there by just enclosing it in parentheses and putting an open close paren. And that's why I talk about it. Think about an invocation operator. Because if I enclose the entire value in parentheses and then put that open paren and in my other parameters, I can actually execute the code right there as I've declared it. This can actually be useful sometimes. We'll talk about some uses for that a little bit later. Now, if you declare a parameter in your parameter list, the variable listing in your function declaration, and you don't have the right number of parameters, in a lot of languages that would give you an error, but not in this one. As a matter of fact, if you don't pass any parameters at all, there's not going to be any errors occur until you actually try to use the parameter variable that you left out. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is that some functions are self-contained. They don't need any arguments at all. So the interpreter doesn't know that when it first looks at the function declaration. The other reason is that you might choose to initialize the variables. Now, unlike other languages, you have to initiate your variables in the code block. We'll talk about how to do that in a little bit. Not in the parameter list. So, again, there may not be an error. And also, the order, it's not going to check the order either. So, these are things you need to keep in mind when you use this. Now, before we talk about the expression form, we have to understand a few things. Do you remember in the data types video I said anything that is not a primitive is an object? Functions are not a primitive. Therefore, they are an object. This is the first place where that becomes important. In JavaScript, because they're objects, they can be used as values. Notice that's why I try to differentiate stuff on the return. We're not talking, in this case, the value being returned from the function. We're talking the function itself is a value. You can pass these functions as parameters, and we can return functions as values from other functions. This is what the expression form of that value looks like. Because a function is an object, we can assign a function to a variable. So in this case, I have the name of the function, the expression statement equals, the keyword function, my parameter list, and then the function declaration, just as we've already discussed. Now we're going to go on to see in this series that this is actually the better form to actually use most of the time. But we're going to see a partial hint of the possibilities of this right now by looking at this keyword I just put up here, var. That has to do with the next subject of our next slide, which is scope. In this language, variables default to global. That's unlike most other programming languages. This means that if you have a global variable, it can be accessed from anywhere in your program. So it can be overwritten by other code. Somebody else wants to use the same name for something. All kinds of bad things could happen. Now, occasionally global variables are desirable. I'm not saying never use them. However, the use is somewhat limited. Normally, that's not what you want. So the var keyword, the one I just used up there, is what you use to limit the scope of the function. So what that means is now if you use the var in front of a variable, that variable will be visible only within the function in which it was declared. Now this has block level, or I should say not block level, it has function level scope, which means anywhere in that function you can access that variable. Even if that function contains other functions. Yes, in this language, functions can contain functions. Remember we said we could pass them out? That also is some important thing we'll get into when we get into closure. So the other thing you want to remember is that if you have a parameter list, if the parameter variables you created that parameter list, those parameters have only local scope, which is, that means you don't have to put a var statement in front of those. Now, while I'm on the subject of scope, and before I leave functions, and this is kind of where we're going to leave part 1 of functions at, we're going to talk about the keyword this. Okay, it's a special object. Actually, it's not even an object. I kind of think of it more as a pointer. But what it's pointing to and what you access from it is going to be variable depending upon context. In other languages, the this refers to the current instance of the current class. In JavaScript, that's not true. If a function is created with a statement form, and it's not some part of some other object, which usually if it's statement form, it isn't, and you are running ECMAScript under the ECMAScript 3 rules, then it's going to return a reference to the global object. A lot of people thought that was bad, including myself. So in the ES5, the this, if it's in this particular situation, is undefined. Now, if you have ES3 and you do want to use this, and I strongly suggest you don't, but if you do, the global object on browsers is the window object. So when a function is used as a constructor, it's going to refer to the current instance of the current function. This is one of those other invocation patterns I talked about when we were at the beginning, how to invoke functions. So what a constructor does is it's going to initialize a new object and set its values. And how do we know that a function is a constructor? Well, we precede it with the keyword new. I think that's enough on that. We'll try to get a little more when we get us into objects. Now, the other thing is when it's called as a method. So what's a method? A method is a function within another object. I'm going to say class, but this language doesn't have classes. So think about it as an object that has some ability to carry out some actions. I'll try to explain that a little bit more clearly later. But when you use the method form of invocation, what you're going to get with a this keyword is the calling a reference to the calling object, normally the parent. So with that, I think we pretty much covered at least what we can do on functions without discussing objects. So obviously that means my next video will be objects. But before we go, let's take a look summary of what we talked about here. First of all, we have to realize that functions are code that is meant to be used later. A function is called by using its name and opening, closing parentheses surrounded by 0 or more parameters. Functions may or may not return a value. Functions or objects can be used as value. I want to repeat, not just the result of the function's execution. The function itself is the value. If a declared parameter is missing or out of order, no error is generated. Functions may be declared in statement or expression form, and variables default to global scope. You can use the var keyword to limit variable to function scope, and the this keyword may refer to the global object, the calling object, the current instance of the running function, or be undefined based upon context. So that should be it for this video. Thanks for watching these. I hope you're getting something out of them. I look forward to talking to you the next one, which will be, again, objects. Thanks a lot. Bye.